By dawn, the Australians were already walking away. Their transport had been refused, their plans dismissed. Their uniforms looked immaculate, their boots polished, but the American commander saw only outsiders, strangers who didn't belong. He could not have known that within 48 hours. The same soldiers he rejected would save hundreds of lives, turning what should have been disaster into an invisible victory. February 1943. Deep in the jungles of New Guinea, a U.S. operations camp was preparing for what they thought was routine. Supply lines were secure, observation posts manned, maps meticulously plotted. But unseen, the Japanese were moving through the mist and mud, slipping into positions the Americans would never anticipate. And the people who would make the difference were sent packing, told politely but firmly, "This isn't your fight." The stakes were enormous. Thousands of soldiers, American and Australian alike, depended on the success of a single operation, securing an airstrip critical to the Allies' Pacific push. If the Japanese captured the high ground first, entire platoons could die. Months of planning would unravel, and the campaign could stall. Lives hung in the balance, and decisions made in tents far from the front lines were about to collide violently with reality. Lieutenant Henry Lawson had seen war at its cruelest. Wiry, weathered, with mud permanently caked in the creases of his face, he had led his men through the Kokoda track, through starvation, disease, and ambushes. Corporal James "Jimmy" O'Connor, barely 21, had already endured months of jungle warfare, learning to read subtle signs of enemy movement. Sergeant Wallace "Wally" Murray had trained soldiers to move through terrain so thick it swallowed men whole. And Private Thomas Riley, a recruit from Queensland, had been hardened in field exercises that mimicked death itself. They arrived expecting to fight, and instead they were turned away. The insult stung. But the Australians would not wait. They retreated to a ridge overlooking the American camp. From there, they observed. Soldiers moved like clockwork below, unaware of the enemy positioning just beyond their line of sight. And the Japanese, silent and disciplined, were already scouting the camp's perimeter, preparing to strike at dawn. Lawson scanned the landscape. The Americans' maps marked certain ravines as impassable, but he knew better. Trained in observation rather than maps, he could see the tracks carved into the mud. The faint disturbances where patrols had passed hours earlier, the subtle changes in vegetation that revealed enemy movement. The Japanese would flank through these paths, bypassing the American defenses entirely. And the Americans, blind to these signals, would march into a trap. Decision time came fast. The Australians moved down the ridge, silent as ghosts. They slid through ferns and swamp, avoided rocks slick with dew, and observed Japanese scouts in their natural rhythm. They counted patrol patterns, timing their movements to avoid detection. Every second mattered. If seen, the mission would be over before it began. The first twist came quickly. A Japanese patrol emerged along a creek, moving in tight formation. Lawson signaled, and the Australians melted into shadow. Riley held his breath, barely daring to move. O'Connor whispered instructions, and they disappeared just meters from the enemy, unnoticed. It was a display of stealth the Americans had refused to trust just hours earlier, and it set the tone for what would come. By mid-morning, they had mapped the enemy's staging area. Rice fires burned in hidden clearings. Tents formed geometric grids. Officers paced along precise axes of advance. Every observation became a decision point. Strike now or wait for nightfall. Engage forward observers or continue tracking. Every choice could cost lives. The first engagement arrived by chance. A sentry caught movement. Instantly, Lawson's team acted. Within seconds, the sentry was neutralized silently, left upright against a tree with a small card tucked into his belt. A calling card, a psychological weapon designed to confuse. Panic rippled quietly through the Japanese unit. O'Connor intercepted radio transmissions. Orders for the main attack were being relayed to battalion commanders. Murray whispered strategies to distort the messages, sending misdirections, planting subtle phrases suggesting phantom units. Confusion spread. Troops hesitated. Officers questioned what they had seen. Every decision by the Australians amplified chaos. Yet obstacles kept coming. Torrential rain flooded ravines. Mudslides slowed progress. Visibility dropped. Japanese patrols shifted unexpectedly. But the Australians adapted. Makeshift rafts crossed rivers, hand signals replaced radios, leaves muffled footsteps. They were ghosts, invisible, untouchable, yet hyper-aware that detection would mean death. By afternoon, they identified the Japanese command post coordinating the assault. This was the critical point. Strike now and risk exposure, or delay and let the enemy advance. Lives hung in the balance. They struck. Officers were eliminated with silent precision. Radios disabled. The illusion of a phantom force, omnipresent and unseen, was complete. In the end, the airstrip was secured. The Pacific campaign advanced. And the Australians, unseen, had changed the course of events. But history, as always, chose to forget. Only those who survived carried the memory, the weight of their fallen comrade, and the knowledge that heroism is often invisible. At dusk, the Japanese began their assault as planned, but chaos erupted immediately. Orders misread. Artillery misfires. Troops charged empty positions. Engineers were trapped in their own minefields. Forward units retreated in panic. The Americans, mostly unaware of the invisible intervention, assumed success was their own doing. Even now, danger remained. Riley was struck by a misfired artillery shell, a cruel irony. He had navigated the jungle flawlessly, avoided detection, and yet death came not from the enemy, but from the unit they had saved. The Australians paid a price, but the immediate threat to the camp was neutralized. Morning revealed the success. American soldiers saw only confusion among the Japanese, not realizing it was orchestrated by the Australians. Commanders praised their own tactical foresight, unaware that survival depended entirely on the men they had dismissed. The remaining Australians extracted quietly, leaving subtle evidence, disrupted camps, disabled radios, calling cards left behind as silent messages. Their deeds would remain unrecognized in official reports, but the Japanese were not finished. Recon units probed the perimeter again that morning, testing defenses. The Australians observed, adapting. They identified forward sappers attempting to breach the American camp. With precision, they intercepted each one, cutting communication wires, neutralizing explosives, leaving only traces of intervention. When Japanese officers radioed in confusion, O'Connor sent back distorted signals, echoes of a phantom army everywhere, nowhere. Panic spread through the ranks like wildfire. As the sun climbed, Lawson realized the Americans were moving toward a fatal misunderstanding. They believed the Japanese retreat was due to their defensive setup, not the Australians' covert maneuvers. The Americans were unknowingly walking into a narrative scripted entirely by forces outside their command. One misstep could still unravel everything. By late afternoon, the Australians had established observation positions closer to the camp. They counted Japanese troop movements, tracked supply lines, and intercepted further communications. Every message sent to the enemy was twisted. Every patrol led into false paths. Every reinforcement delayed. The Japanese assault, once imminent, became a slow-motion collapse of coordination. Even when the Americans began to notice minor discrepancies, misplaced supply crates, unexplained quiet on certain approaches, they assumed it was luck. The Australians remained hidden, invisible architects of survival. Every decision was a balance of risk and reward. Engage too early, and their presence would be exposed. Act too late, and the camp could fall. They acted with the precision of soldiers trained for months in shadows, every movement rehearsed. every breath calculated. By evening, Japanese officers convened in panic. Orders were delayed, troops misdirected, engineers trapped, supplies misallocated. And all the while, the Australians moved like shadows, observing, adjusting, deciding the next critical action. They were everywhere and nowhere at once. Finally, night arrived. The main assault was imminent, but confusion had weakened Japanese coordination. The Australians set the last sequence, a series of controlled sabotage acts, cutting communication wires, subtly disabling weapon caches, creating illusions of attack that never occurred. When the Japanese finally moved forward, they were disoriented, misaligned, and completely unaware that the Australians had orchestrated the collapse from the shadows. By midnight, the threat to the American camp was neutralized. Japanese troops withdrew. Forward sappers were gone, communications disabled, and the planned assault had become a chaotic retreat. Lives were saved. The Americans were unaware of the Australians' role. The team withdrew silently, leaving evidence subtle enough to puzzle the enemy, but invisible to the Americans. Disabled radios, minor sabotage, and calling cards left as signs of phantom units. When dawn came, the camp was intact, supply lines secure, airstrips safe, lives saved. Official reports credited disciplined American command and defensive planning, completely ignoring the Australians who had saved the day. Lawson, Murray, and O'Connor returned quietly, shadows of their own story. Riley was gone, a casualty of the cruelest irony of war. They had faced the enemy, acted with precision, and survived by relying on instinct, courage, and a refusal to accept injustice. Years later, fragments of their mission would surface in personal letters and diaries, but the official narrative remained silent. History would record an American victory, leaving the Australians as ghosts. Yet the lesson endured. Sometimes, survival depends not on regulations, not on appearances, but on those willing to act when bureaucracy fails, to walk into danger without permission, and to save lives no one else even knew were at risk.